Hi there. In this tutorial I'm going to very quickly show you how to make something like this. So the idea is that it's a small planetoid and cycling around it. Also, this is an endless loop. So the actual video is only about 20 or 30 seconds long, but it's a seamless connection between the end of one cycle and the start of the next. If I'm talking here long enough, you'll see that Saturn-like planet come round again. And I'll briefly touch on some of the effects on the water and so on. And this is done in Eevee, although with the new Blender 3.0, the performance of cycles is such that it's probably realistic to do it in that, even with anything other than a really powerful machine, which you'd have needed in previous versions of Blender. And I'm certainly going to spend some time with Blender version 3, and probably my next tutorial will touch on some of the interesting things that have come out with that. So to begin with, we need to build our little mini planet. As you might expect, I can either add a UV sphere or an icosphere. I actually added an icosphere just because the geometry is more even. With a UV sphere, all of the geometry joins at the top and bottom, which may give you some problems with some of the effects we're going to do later on. So I prefer to use an icosphere for something like this. You can even use a cube and continually subdivide it and smooth it to get to quads rather than these triangular faces. And now I'm going to increase the subdivisions quite a bit because we are going to need a lot of geometry. We're up to 81,000 faces there, which is quite high, but we'll see how we go. And I'll set it to shade smooth. We'll call that our planet. And the next thing I'm going to do is go to modifiers, and I'm going to add a displace modifier. So no obvious difference yet, but I'm going to set the strength to 0.1. You'll just see the sphere just shrank again. But then I'm going to click up here and I'm going to say new, and we'll call this ground txt1. I'm going to leave the coordinates on local and the direction normal. So the normal means that when this displaces, it will be displacing in and out of the sphere, not particularly up or down. And local, it's just using the coordinates of the sphere rather than the universe, as it were. So then we'll click these little dots here, and that will just take us to where we can set up the noise texture that we're going to use to create the surface. I'm going to change this to distorted noise, and you can already see we're getting something interesting going on. I left mine on Blender Original for the noise basis, and the distortion I set to improved Perlin, but you can play around and see what gives you something that you find interesting. I set the size down slightly to 0.2. You can see that's changing the scale of the noise, and that will depend on the size of the sphere and so on. I've used just the default size. And to begin with, that's all I need to do there. And because I added enough geometry, I added 7 subdivisions, that's already given me a reasonably good sphere. You may need to go back to your modifiers and add another modifier, which would be a subdivision surface modifier, and that may be a better thing to do rather than add the amount of geometry that I did. You can get away with it more easily with Blender 3 because it handles large meshes better, but you can see even here just adding a subdivision surface is taking a little while. Now that's just put the subdivision surface on top of the displacement modifier, so all it's really doing is smoothing it out. Whereas what you want to do is add more geometry so that there's more detail in the displacement. So you need to move this up to the top. And now that means that the full detail of the displacement modifier can be more visible. I'm going to add another displace modifier. So I'm just going to say duplicate. I'll minimize the first one. I'll click this little 2 here, and that will mean we'll create a copy of the texture that we're using, and I'll change that to ground txt2. It's looking weird because they're both just adding on top of each other at the moment. But I'm also going to turn the strength of this one down a long way. We'll go for 0.003 for the moment, so it's a much less significant modifier. And for this one I used improved Perlin for the top and Voronoi F1 for the bottom. So that's noise basis was improved Perlin and distortion was Voronoi F1. And the size I set to 0.002 for my particular scale. And you can now see we've got some very fine sort of bump. Now we can go back to here and we can play with the strength. We could go up to 0.005, see what that looks like. And you can see it's just giving us a little bit more texture for the ground. Just note that by default your subdivision surface will render at more subdivisions than you necessarily need. If I go up one now, you can see that's showing even more detail there, which you may or may not want, but I'll put that down back to 1 just to make it easier for things while we're editing. So I'm now going to duplicate this sphere, and I could have done that before. So Shift D, and you can see it's got the sphere there, and then just press Escape to release it. If you want to make it do that quicker, if you've already put the modifiers on, just turn them off here in the viewport. But I'm going to delete them from this one. This is Planet 001 at the moment. And arguably, you don't even need as much geometry as I've got for this one either. However, we're going to call this one water now. And then we can just scale in or out just to get the amount of ground that we want. So probably somewhere around there. And then I'm going to hold Shift and click the planet again, the ground again, Control P, and just say set parent to object keep transform. So now when I move the planet around, the water will move with it. And we'll just select our water and give it a basic water material for the moment so we can easily see what's what. And we'll just set that to a greenish color there so we can see which is which, and something similar. So the next thing to do is to set up our camera. So I'll look from above, and there is our camera. I'm going to make it a little smaller so that it's appropriately scaled, and we'll put it something like here to start with. And I'm going to add under curves a circle. Rotate Y 90, and then what I'm going to do is in edit mode, so just press tab to go into edit mode. I'm going to right click and I'm going to say subdivide, and we'll just go with one subdivision for the moment. We may add more later on. I'm just going to now roughly place some of the points for my curve such that it's as if we're on some kind of vehicle trying to avoid the highest points in the terrain. I'm just going around the planet. By the way, if you want your viewport camera to center on the terrain, just select the water or the planet, press dot on a numpad, and then you'll orbit around much more easily. You can see by having all 3 of the control points selected, I can change the way that the whole thing works. Doing this very quickly. You don't want anything too extreme in terms of switchbacks because it gets very jarring if you're looking at that on the camera. So as a very rough approximation, there's our starting point. We now go to our camera. I'll put it there, but we don't really know where the start of the curve is yet. There's various ways you can do this, but I'm just going to select my camera and go to constraints, add a constraint, and add a follow path constraint. Under target, we'll select the Bezier circle, and this normally happens, the camera's gone shooting off. And we also need to say animate path. If you don't do that, nothing's going to happen. Now you can see the camera is following the path now, but obviously it's not quite right yet. I've just selected Z as my up axis and Y as my forward axis. So I just need to now move my camera in, and obviously I need to rotate. That's approximately it, and bring my camera down coincident with the line. Doesn't necessarily have to be completely perfect, but it does need to be reasonably close. Now at the moment you can see the camera's just pointing in one direction, which isn't what we want. So if we say follow curve, now the camera is pointing along the curve. It's going quite quickly, but roughly speaking, you can see it's doing what we want it to do. So the first reason it's going quite quickly is even though we've got 250 frames in our animation, we go to the curve properties under path animation, it's being animated over 100 frames. So that would need to be 250 to do one cycle for the animation length that we've currently got. You can see that's a little slower. That said, it's still quite fast given how close we are to the object. So I ended up with something like 1,000 frames. So I'm going to set my animation to 1,000 frames there, and I'm going to set the time it takes to complete a cycle to 1,000 frames on the curve. So it's exactly the same, except it will now be a lot more slow. Now because of the nature of this and with the randomness going on and so on, if you want terrain to be in view and not clipping all the time, like it is there, there's a couple of things we need to do. So first thing I would do is go to the camera properties and put the clip start quite close. So I'm going to set that to 0.01, and you can see it doesn't clip until we get very close now. The next thing to do is select the Bezier circle, go into edit mode and start tweaking it. So I've selected this point here just ahead, and I'm going to lift it up slightly. So you can see the landscape is still clipping there, so we need to get a little higher, and then we'll go on round. And here we've got no landscape. So what we may need to do is rotate that in slightly. What we can also do, of course, if I come out of edit mode, select the camera and press RXX, I can point the camera down slightly. I'm trying to keep the horizon roughly level, but you will find it will occasionally go off, and you can drag it back down by selecting part of the curve. You can also press Ctrl T, and that actually allows you to rotate or twist that part of the curve as well, which there's no other way to do that in order to straighten things up a little bit. So if I use just the forward key and see where we're going, you can see it's probably a little bit high there. So I'm just normal rotating there just to drag it down a little bit so that we can get a bit of horizon in, and then let it continue. And generally trying to, just a bit of Control T there just to tweak the horizon again. And you'll need to do this really going through the whole thing because of the relative randomness of the terrain. This is quite good because it's lifting up and jumping over the terrain there, but now we want it to go down. Again, this may be why you need to add additional points. So I've now selected the point just ahead of the camera, and I've selected this point just behind the camera as well. Right click and just say subdivide. So that's just been placed on the curve at the moment. I can now select that point and just drag it down. Basically, you don't want the camera looking at the sky for too long, otherwise you haven't really got anything to look at. And you don't really want it clipping by going through the terrain either. So just to recap, select each point ahead of the camera that you need to, move it around a little bit so that it avoids the terrain, and then do the same as the camera goes through. As you press the right arrow just to move through, just to see what the camera is looking at as it goes. Need be, you can open another window up and set that to 3D viewport, and then just press 0 and you can see the view of the camera. And here we've got a nice view where we can see what the camera is doing, and we can see at the top there what the camera will see. You can go through and tweak these various points, but this is why you don't want to add too many points. Only add additional points where you need to, otherwise that's an awful lot to tweak, because you'll find twisting is one of the main problems where the horizon gets out of kilter with the camera, so the camera will be sort of side on occasionally, and that's obviously not something you want. So as long as the length of your animation, in this case 1000 frames, is the same as the length of the path animation, you've already created an animation which will cycle round seamlessly. So we'll just put some light in the scene. I'm going to set this to Eevee because there's a couple of things I wanted to show, and I'm going to set this to the shader editor up here. We'll select the water. We will add a lamp in the scene, which will just be an area lamp to start with. We'll set the background for the time being just to black, and we'll see what we've got. And I'll turn off the floor and the grid. Under the lamp properties, it's always worth turning on contact shadows, because you can see without those you get some weird effect, but turn them on and it's much better. If we come up here, we'll turn on screen space reflections. That won't make a lot of difference yet, but under shadows we'll turn on soft shadows. So I'm just going to shrink the water a little bit more there. Now, just to make the water interesting, I decided to add some subsurface to it. So I'm going to set the base color now to quite a dark blue color. Then I'm going to set a subsurface color which is quite strong green, and I set subsurface to 0.3. You can see Eevee was reloading there, and we've now got a sort of gradient between that blue color and the greeny subsurface color. And you can play around with that. You can try different degrees of subsurface. You can see the more I go to the left, the more blue it is. The more I go to the right, the more of the green we get. But somewhere around the 0.3 mark seemed to get an interesting version. It just adds an extra element of depth to it. Because it's essentially a liquid, I set the roughness down very low, 0.005, and we can immediately see a problem here, which I'm going to deal with in a minute. But you can see we've got reflections on the surface now. So in fact, before we go onward, I'm going to deal with this issue. So the issue is that I'm using an area lamp, but the area lamp is very much showing up in the reflection. It doesn't show up in the scene, but it does show up in reflection. So there's a workaround for this. If I go to my area lamp, you'll see there's separate sliders for diffuse, specular and volumetric. If I turn specular down to 0, you'll notice that that reflection disappears. We also lose some other things. We lose some of the highlights, but as a general way to just give some illumination without it showing up in the reflections, that's fine. So the reason for me using an area lamp was because I had that planet in the distance, and I wanted what appeared to be reflected light, irradiance if you like, showing on the planet I'm traversing. However, irradiance doesn't really work in Eevee. So in other words, you can't so much reflect light other than as a reflection in a shiny object off another object to show up on the back surface of the planet. So I cheated by putting a coloured area lamp on one side, and then that gave that effect. You still have the issue even with point lights, but it's not as bad because they are, as the name suggests, a point light. I'll put one of those in over here. You can see it there, but I can turn the radius right down, so it'll only be at certain points where it will show up at all. And you might not have a problem with it. It may be fine that it shows up like that, perhaps like that. But I'll set it down to 0. And then I turned the power up quite high, so we'll have that 500 to start with, but we'll set it a bit further away so that we get shadows and what have you. So I did quite a complicated shader just for the terrain itself, but we'll quickly put that together. So I'm going to add an input which is a texture coordinate because I haven't unwrapped this. I'm also going to add texture which is an image texture, and I used this text here, rock layered 0002 from CD Textures. I used the object texture coordinates into my rock layer image, and then of course that goes into the color input here. So you can see we've got this banded rock texture appearing. I could have used that as the source for adding some additional surface texture, but I decided not to in this case. I decided to go another route. Before I did that, I'm going to add another texture, which is a noise texture. Set that to a scale of about 13, detail up to 16, 15 or 16. Looks like they've limited it to 15 now. And then add a converter, which is a color ramp. Take the factor output into the input of the color ramp, and then just tweak these pointers in a little bit just to control and set this to B-spline. And I used that to affect the roughness of my rock, so it's not always the same level of shininess essentially. There'll be shinier areas and less shiny areas now. The other thing I did was that I set the lower end, which essentially would be the most shiny part, not to black, because otherwise that's almost a mirror-like shine for those areas. So I'm going to change this to a sort of mid-grey, and that just makes sure we haven't got any mirror shiny elements to the rock, but we have variations in the shininess. I'm then going to take a duplicate of the noise texture, but this time I'm going to set it up to about 950 scale, and I'm going to add a vector bump node, take the factor into the height, set the strength to about 0.15 for me, and then take the normal output into the normal input on the shader. And you should be able to see now that's giving us some additional surface texture. And you may need to play with the strength. We'll try 0.05 for example, and that's much more subtle, maybe 0.1. So it's just more texture on the surface. And if you want to, you can take object coordinates in there, which will change the way the noise is distributed on the surface. May make it look a little more natural. And then finally, for the last bit of additional detail, another noise texture. This one I set to 125, add a converter, which is a math node, set that to multiply and set the lower value. I set it to 0.01. It's dividing it really, it's multiplying it by 0.01. Take the factor into one side and then take the output into displacement. And again, that adds some additional noise. So all of these noise inputs add together to give you a more interesting texture for the surface. You can see it's a more rock-like texture now. If I turn the outline off, and you can play around with the levels of this noise as well. There, I've gone slightly smaller there, 0.005. And the last thing I'll just show you, and I've shown this a number of times before, is setting up a starry field that doesn't have joins and things like that in it. So we'll click up here and we'll go to world. We'll click use nodes. I'm going to add under color a mix node and connect that into the background. The top I'm going to set to black. I want colored stars, so I'm actually going to use the direct output of a noise texture, which is colored noise, to take the color output, not the factor in this case, and put that into the other side. So you can see we've got a blend here between the black, which is on the one side, and this colored noise, and I'm going to set the scale to 500. So now I need to zoom in and you can see it's just random colored noise. And set the detail up. Now we need it to be mostly black with just little dots. So I have my favorite node, under converter, a color ramp. We'll take the factor out for this one because we don't need colored output. And we'll move the control points very close together. Just put them like that for now. And I'm going to set it to cardinal, which is a more abrupt fall off. And then take the color output into the factor on that mix node. And then I'm going to set the strength for my background up to 10. So you'll need to tweak these around. You can see if you go too far, you have basically no stars. But as they come back, more and more stars appear in the sky. And believe it or not, they are actually coloured. All sorts of different colours. And you just need to go to a level which you think it looks appropriate, something like that maybe. And you can even turn the strength up higher if you want. It won't give you more stars, but it'll make the stars you have brighter. And as I say, you can play around with this. This gives you a greater contrast as you drag this one to the left. This one gives you more or less stars. You're basically selecting for stars that are in that range. And that's basically all there is to creating a seamless looped animation. You can see I haven't adjusted some of this in Eevee for a little planet. So I hope you enjoyed that tutorial. If you did, don't forget to click like and subscribe. I will share the original file with my Patreon subscribers. And if there's any questions you've got, please don't hesitate to put questions in the comments below. I'll do my best to answer all of them, and I'll see you in the next tutorial. Thanks a lot.